The Panic of 1837. So it was the Panic of 1837. Basically, it was a financial crisis in the United States, and it lasted until about the mid-1840s. Profits and prices and wages went down, while unemployment went up drastically. Also, pessimism took place, and basically everybody didn't see any positivity to the future. Everything was negative. So what caused the panic? Well, the Bank of the United States issued paper notes at the time, and the only catch was that if someone wanted to cash in their notes, they could only receive a hard currency, which was basically only gold or silver. So you could convert your money was directly convertible into gold or silver. The bank also had very strict lending restrictions, and some believed that the policies were a little too strict and were actually hurting their own business. Some bankers also didn't trust the system. For example, if you were from New York, you wouldn't necessarily trust the Philadelphia-based banks because of the region, and it was mainly a private monopoly, so if you weren't really in the circle, you didn't really get treated, I guess, as upscale as, you would. Also, the economy was doing all right, but was slowly decreasing because of the bank, and Jackson, who was president at the time, vetoed the recharter bill because of his views of the bank. The bank was a private monopoly and would just make the rich more rich and powerful, and basically if that kept on going, the economy would just not be good. The poor people would just suffer. Also, many immigrants were taking over the bank, and he believed that the bank should be, a 100% pure American bank since it's the Bank of the United States. So his veto was popular, and he ended up getting reelected. However, some were still unhappy that the bank was no longer, living, because money was now floating around, and businesses were collapsing everywhere. And that's why individuals panicked, because they were financially ruined. The economy was a disaster, and the panic lasted for several years before it slowly started to recover. So although the veto was a good choice, it also left some consequences that affected everybody no matter which way you'd go. Here's a really good video I found about the Panic of 1837.
Although the Supreme Court had established the legality of the Bank of the United States, the bank itself came under close scrutiny in the early years of Andrew Jackson's first administration. For its part, the bank felt it provided a service to the American people and the young nation as a whole. Led by Nicholas Biddle, the bank served as a rudimentary central bank of the United States, privately owned to be sure, but due to its large size and wealth, it could effectively regulate the availability of credit throughout the nation by controlling the lending policies of state and other small banks. At the same time, banks issued paper notes, and their only concern was if the owner of these notes wished to cash them in, so to speak, and retrieve hard currency. For you see, in those days, money was directly convertible into gold or silver, so the bank had to have enough of both on hand to handle customer demands. Since most of the paper notes eventually made their way to the Bank of the United States, the bank could effectively pressure smaller banks to keep their lending policies in check. Biddle's bank oversight served to rein in excessive borrowing and lending policies that were all too common in Jacksonian America when the economy was booming and speculation was the rule of the day. People were looking for quick investments, quick cash, and quick returns, and for much of Jackson's years in office, they were succeeding. But the Bank of the United States had enemies on many fronts. There were those who distrusted paper currency on the whole, no matter which bank was issuing it, feeling anything other than gold and silver, known as hard currency, was a disaster waiting to happen. And some local bankers felt Biddle was too restrictive on their own lending policies, hurting their business. New York bankers also did not like or trust a Philadelphia-based bank and felt it unfair that New York City did not have the nation's central bank in its own city limits. They would ask themselves, why turn over such immense profits to Biddle? Finally, there were those who simply distrusted the monopoly the bank had. One institution having so much power, invested in the hands of one individual, just seemed like too much. The situation would come to a head during the election of 1832. Jackson, still very popular among the constituencies that had elected him in 1828, faced his old foe Henry Clay in the general election. Clay rallied anti-Jackson forces and won the favor of Biddle and the Bank of the United States. Both realized they needed each other in order to defeat Jackson. Jackson also realized that the bank and its new allies were seeking to cast him out of office. A showdown was inevitable. Clay and his allies believed that the bank was too important to the United States and that voters would realize this too. What is more, Congress would seek to force Jackson to sign the bank's bill of recharter in the months prior to the election, a move that was unnecessary since the first charter did not expire until 1836. Unnecessary, but it was politically expedient. Should Jackson fail to sign the bill, Clay and his allies believed it would clearly show how out of touch Jackson was to the interest of the country and to the realities of finance. Congress passed the recharter bill in July of 1832, and the country waited breathlessly to see what Jackson would do. Would he sign the bill and then argue against the bank's future, or would he veto it and risk it becoming a campaign issue to be used against him? Not one to shy away from a fight, Jackson promptly vetoed it. His reasons for vetoing the bank's charter were simple. It was dangerous. It was a private monopoly. And in his view, that made a few rich and powerful people more rich and more powerful. Furthermore, many of the stockholders were foreigners. Gasp. And any bank of the U.S. should be a 100% purely American bank. It turned out that Jackson's veto was a popular move, and Jackson coasted to re-election. After his election, it became his singular purpose to do away with the bank before his charter expired in 1836. He promptly ordered the withdrawing of all U.S. deposits from the bank. Attempts by Biddle to fight back by restricting lending and pressuring Jackson to ease up failed, and in the end, he gave in. By 1841, the Bank of the United States was liquidated, and no more. The war over the bank did have consequences, including the financial panic of 1837. The panic had many causes, and like most financial crises, was the result of a complicated series of events. First and foremost, killing the Bank of the United States meant that there was a vacuum to be filled by state banks and other private banks. New banks rapidly sprang up, offering money to finance American expansion on every front. Banks wildly speculated on American growth, hoping for quick and large returns on projects. With so much money floating around, inflation skyrocketed. The government noticed and ordered that all government lands had to be bought with gold or silver, but the hard currency never came. Banks called in their loans. Many couldn't pay. Property went into foreclosure. Prices collapsed. Businesses shuttered. Individuals went bankrupt. Panic set in. By 1837, thousands were financially ruined, with an estimated 343 out of 850 banks forced to cease operations. From the shopkeeper to the farmer to the banker, many were left with nothing. In a time when there was no social welfare safety net, it was disastrous. It would take years before the American economy would recover.